start. Welcome to the webinar. The title is Addressing Mental Health Challenges Using Horticulture-Focused Programs. This webinar is hosted by the Florida Horticulture for Health Network and the Nova Scotia Horticulture for Health Network. Are you still able to see my slide here? There we go. I must have clicked by mistake. I'm Leslie Fleming. I'm hosting the webinar and I'm supported by Daniela Perez-Langones and Bree Stark, who are doing the technical side. Thank you, ladies, for helping with that. This webinar explores how horticulture programming, horticulture and garden settings are addressing a variety of mental health challenges, including trauma, mood disorder, substance use, and other diagnoses. So several programs are going to be presented, all with considerations for special circumstances, working with adolescents, serving individuals in inpatient and outpatient programs, and respecting neurodiversity. Beginning with an overview of mental health illnesses and diagnoses, the presenters, both who work with the populations, will provide examples where horticulture is playing a key role in recreation and health interventions with a specific focus on this. And the second part of the presentation, we're going to hear from Hillary on Common Roots Urban Farm Woodside in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. So starting off the webinar is Morgan Whitaker-Smith, and I'm going to stop my screen sharing. And Morgan, how about if you pull up your PowerPoint?
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, so I'd like to introduce Morgan. She is a professionally licensed mental health counselor working primarily with the serious and persistent mental illness population at Peace River Center for Professional Development, nonprofit in Florida. She is a trauma specialist with training in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, accelerated resolution therapy, and dialectical behavioral therapy. And she is expanding her repertoire to include horticultural therapy and applications for mental health populations. She's currently enrolled in the University of Florida Certificate Program in horticultural therapy and undergraduate certificate environmental horticulture management. So Morgan, thanks for sharing your cross-discipline expertise. We're really looking forward to what you have to say. So please take it away.
Thank you so much. Well, I am just so grateful to be here today and to be able to share this. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So I just wanted to start out by just mentioning that nothing that is in this presentation, our webinar today, is meant to be construed as medical advice or mental health advice. It's just for informational purposes and to kind of give you an overview of things. So please, if you are in need of supports, we encourage you to reach out to your local resources. And I also want to mention that when we talk about mental health, sometimes it can be triggering based upon our backgrounds and our unique experiences. So if there's anything that we talk about today that ends up being difficult for you or triggering, we encourage you to reach out and get support in your local area or to call the National Suicide Hotline if you're in need of support on it. As we are moving forward in the webinar or at any point afterwards. So thank you again for allowing me to be here today. And I'm going to kind of walk us through a little bit of an overview of mental health and also how horticultural therapy and people-plant interactions can impact our mental health, hopefully in very positive ways. So when we think about mental health, it used to be that we thought about two categories of people. We put people into categories of either mentally healthy, mentally well, or mentally ill, mentally unwell. And what we have come to realize over time is that this is not a very helpful way of looking at mental health in general. And actually what exists is a broad spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, we have what might be conceived as like ideal mental wellness when we are functioning at our best. And on the other end of the spectrum, we might consider things that are what we might call a mental health crisis or emergency, like a suicide emergency or a psychosis state, something like that. Most of us do not spend very much time at all in one or the other of these extremes. We spend our time in this spectrum in the middle, and we have things that move us in the positive direction and things that move us in the negative direction, and that's our normal life, right? Up and down. So when we talk about a mental health diagnosis or disorder, we're looking at times, not just a rough day or a difficult time, but sometime when we've spent a significant period of time in this category of where we're to the point where something isn't working for us and it's beginning to interfere with our daily life. It's really causing us to not be able to function the way we want to be able to move forward in our lives, to do the things we want to do. And we're just not experiencing the quality of life that we really want to. Sometimes there are things that are factors in the external world that cause this, and sometimes there are things internally, biologically. Sometimes there's things that are in our control, like our diet and how much water we're drinking, and sometimes it's things that are not, like global pandemic, those kind of things. So what happens is this complex mixture of factors moves us along this spectrum. And when we get to times when we have experienced a long period of time when things are not going so well, we begin to cross that threshold over into a mental health diagnosis, a time when the mental health symptoms are impairing our ability to live our best lives. So what happens with horticulture, which is so wonderful, and people-plant interactions, is that these are things that are within our control that we can do that gradually move us toward the healthy end of the spectrum. They do that by allowing us to discharge stress hormones, to calm our physiological arousal, meaning when our body is in that keyed up, stressed out state, and also allows us in some instances to have positive interactions with other people. So if we think about the stress response cycle, what happens when we get stressed out is that our minds are always scanning our environment for threats. This helped us back when we were, evolving, right? We didn't get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. We're always scanning our environment for threats. If we perceive a threat, our body floods with stress hormones. We get psychologically aroused. And then when we are in that state, we have difficulty being able to process information, but we are also able to run faster, our heart's pounding, our breathing is more shallow, and we're able to get away. And then what's supposed to happen is that we would complete that stress cycle and discharge those stress hormones once the threat is gone. In real life, what our threats look like are like, email that we get that is threatening to us, or our boss says, I need to talk to you later, but there's no context, something like that. And we often don't have a chance to discharge the stress hormones because we move on with our day and we go, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. So when we engage in horticultural practices, we allow our bodies to calm. We allow those stress hormones to discharge. We allow ourselves to begin to return to that baseline, which feels really, really good and is super important for our brains and our bodies to be able to function at their best. This can also happen. There's some research that shows that just observing nature can do this, but also the tangible, being out in doing things, digging in the dirt, playing with the plants, doing things like that can be a form of stress relief as well. So this is very important for our positive mental health, and it's something we can do that moves us toward that positive end of things. So when we think about horticulture specifically, many people who are experiencing mental health challenges have that heightened state of arousal. We have perceived threats, and it's hard for us to get ourselves calm back down. We have trouble with the baseline at that point. So horticulture provides a mechanism for us to work ourselves toward the baseline. There's a lot of other mechanisms we can do too. We can take a hot shower, we can take a walk, we can practice meditation, we can do all kinds of things. We can drink a lot of water. But horticulture is an important one of those for people that it works well for, because it allows us to connect with our environment and to begin to calm down. It also enables us to practice mindful attention, which has been shown to be very critically connected with positive mental health. So we think that we are good at multitasking. Research shows our brains are terrible at multitasking, and it's really not helpful for us to try to do it. So when we are engaged with plants, we're enjoying nature, we're focused on what's in front of us, and our brain goes, oh, thank you. And we begin to experience that decreasing of the stress hormones. It's also an opportunity for us to practice gentle nurturing, because many of us are very harsh with ourselves. And so we don't always nurture ourselves. One of the things that I sometimes tell people as a therapist is that you need to go into houseplant mode. We need to think about, do I need water? Do I need sunlight? Do I need a safe place where I'm not being attacked by the cat? What does your houseplant need? Whatever your houseplant needs, that's probably what you need as a person too. So we practice that nurturing, and those practices then help us to nurture ourselves as well. So those practices begin to spill out into our lives in other ways. So let's talk about some of the different types of mental health disorders. Some mental health disorders come about as a result of experiences that we have. For instance, trauma. There's a variety of different types of disorders that can develop as a result of trauma. Probably the most well-known of those is PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are other ones as well. And when we talk about trauma in a clinical sense, we're not talking about, oh, my favorite show was canceled and I was so traumatized, the kind of colloquial sense that we use that. We're talking about trauma in the sense of times when we felt that our sense of safety and security was threatened and we were powerless over the situation. That is sort of the definition of trauma. And so because those things are innately, by definition, a sense of powerlessness, the brain, when it experiences trauma, sometimes gets stuck sort of at that higher level of arousal. We can't get ourselves back down to baseline. So that's where trauma treatment comes in, because we are teaching people how to be able to manage the experiences that they've had and be able to calm the body back down. So if you think about a combat veteran, what happens in combat? That person needs to be in that heightened state of arousal. They need to be vigilant about their environment. They need to be able to anticipate threats at all times. But if that person comes home and they're feeling that way and at home, that can create issues for them. What kept them alive and safe in one situation becomes problematic in another situation. So we use horticulture in that case to help them, again, be able to channel where that vigilant needs to go. So we're training their brain. Is this a threatening situation? If it's not, how do I begin to get my body and my brain calmed back down so that my level of arousal matches the threat level of the situation? Once we get back down there, we're able to manage our lives a little bit better. Gardening provides a way to do this, right? Because it enables us to be in a relatively, hopefully safe environment where we are, we're not like, in a closet or something like that. There's a certain level of situational arousal, but it hopefully is a safe level of situational arousal. And over time, that begins to allow that person to bring their baseline arousal back down to where it needs to be. Mood disorders can be a similar sort of thing. So a mood disorder can include something like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. Basically, these are disorders where the person is experiencing a mood state that does not match what they want it to be. So depression can be characterized by struggling to be able to, with motivation, not feeling pleasure in things that used to be pleasurable. Sometimes it can also involve feelings of negativity and sadness. Anxiety is the heightened state of arousal. So depression is the mood may not be able to be aroused enough. And in anxiety, it might be aroused too much. And sometimes people go up and down through that, which is why you'll often hear people refer to depression and anxiety. They're two separate things, but a lot of time people experience both of them. So when we're experiencing both of them, the gardening state and doing those types of mindful activities allow us to be able to regulate the arousal level back to where we want it to be. So for someone that's experiencing depression, it can be activating in a good way. It can be something to get out and do, fresh air, something that allows you to feel like you are participating, you're nurturing something. And because it allows you to have the sense of connectedness to the earth, it can bring that level up to where it needs to be. For anxiety, it does the opposite thing. It brings that level of arousal down to where it needs to be by just discharging those stress hormones, giving the person a safe place to be in their environment. So the act of regulating that amount of physiological arousal can help that person to cope with the symptoms that they are experiencing. Now, many times this is not going to be done in isolation. It's going to be in conjunction with a treatment team who's working on helping that person address any underlying brain chemistry kinds of things, teaching them skill sets and everything like this. So a lot of times in programs, it can work very well to have therapists that are working specifically on the types of mental health treatments, but also giving that person the environment in the horticultural environment to be able to practice and implement those strategies, which is very wonderful. Let's talk about substance use disorders. Probably one of the most misunderstood mental health disorders, because a lot of times we have in the past conceptualized it as like a moral failing when someone was addicted to something. It's not. What happens with substance use disorders is a very complex combination of brain chemistry and environmental cues and habits and behaviors. There's all kinds of things that go into this. It used to be in the past that we treated substance use disorders very punitively. We would tell people, you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you need to get yourself going. And we've thankfully come to a realization that doesn't work. And so what does work with substance use disorders, which is, can be addiction to any number of different kinds of substances characterized by tolerance and by increased need for that behavior, even when it's causing negative consequences for you. What can be helpful is to enhance motivation for caregiving, teaching people how to take care of themselves and giving them a reason to do it. And then also helping them to understand the value in what they're doing in their lives and having a tangible purpose and meaning to do this. So here's an example of that. There's a program called Individual Placement and Support, which helps people to get jobs, people who have mental health disorders, to get jobs quickly, not after they've gotten everything straightened out, not after they've been able to get all of their, symptoms under control, not after they've been able to manage their substance use disorders. The idea is you get somebody a job quickly, and then you help them manage these things as they have that sense of meaning and purpose. I shouldn't be surprised by how well this works anymore, but because I've seen it work, but I'm amazed all the time at how many times someone who's been really struggling with substance use and has not been able to overcome that, they get a job, they have a sense of meaning and purpose, and then they are able to begin tackling that because there's a reason, there's a way to do that. Growing plants can be a huge part of that because it enables someone to be able to have a sense of doing something, a sense of taking care of something, and it provides immediate feedback. What happens if you don't water them? They don't do so well. So if you need a sense of meaning and purpose, horticulture gives you that sense of meaning and purpose. It gives you something that you're doing, and it teaches you how to do caregiving in the same process. So if you think about it, the idea of being in charge of something living is a very powerful motivator for someone. How many times have you been amazed when you've planted something and then it grew? It's so cool. You plant seeds, they sprout. It's amazing. So the idea that you tenderly care for them, you water them, you adjust their lighting, you figure out what they need, you problem solve with them, that's powerfully motivating when you have had trouble caring for yourself in the past. And many times substance use is treated very well by having shared models, shared caregiving models between people. So recovery programs often use peer support, people who have experienced things who can support other people who are going through similar types of things. So in this sense, horticulture can be used for substance users in community gardens, residential treatment facilities, other types of group activities, because not only is there that individual sense of purpose, but now there's also a group sense of purpose. So I'm getting not just the feedback of caring for this plant and watching it thrive, but also I'm getting positive feedback and support and accountability from my group members, which is very powerful for substance use disorders and can be very, very motivating. And the important thing to know about substance use disorders is there's healing that's possible. They're not a lifetime sentence. Healing is very possible with them, which is something that we don't always hear people, owning in the mental health field, but it's true. They're very recoverable. Then let's talk about psychosis. So psychosis technically just means a temporary loss of grounding in reality for some reason. So that person is not fully oriented to their surroundings. Now there's this misconception that exists out there that when someone has psychosis, they have it their whole life and it never goes away. But in reality, most people that experience psychosis, it's for discrete periods of time throughout their life. And it doesn't always necessarily mean they have chronic psychosis. They can have it for a brief period of time and then they don't experience it again. Other people, for instance, with like schizophrenia, they may experience it more frequently throughout the lifespan. So what psychosis looks like can be things like hallucinations or delusions. The difference is a hallucination is something you're sensorily experiencing. So like you might be hearing voices, or you might hear gunshots, or you might see things in your environment, or you might feel something on your skin. Some people will actually have smells or taste, that kind of thing. Versus a delusion is a belief that is not grounded in reality. And most delusions are very I mean, people always think of the delusions that are very kind of out there, like, you know, I was abducted by aliens or something like that. But most delusions tend to be more things like everyone at work is conspiring against me and they're going to get me fired, those kind of things that aren't really grounded in reality. So people can experience hallucinations, delusions. They might experience disorganized thoughts. They have trouble putting thoughts together into cohesive speech, and they have trouble like finding words to explain what they're experiencing. They may have impaired emotions, meaning that they might be very flat in the sense that somebody says something very funny, but they just don't really react. They may tell you they're feeling very sad, but there's no emotion on their face, anger, nothing, just very, very blunted is the term that we used for that. And they're not experiencing the joys and the difficulties of that. Their speech may be impaired. So access to the rhythms of nature can be very helpful to someone to regain reality orientation. Oh, it's raining outside. I need to go inside. Oh, I feel the sun is coming up. It's morning. Sometimes people struggle with what time of day it is, that kind of thing. So it gives them a grounding in how to manage their life and begin to recover from that psychosis episode, come back to a firmer grounding in reality. Also, when we're thinking about horticulture, this is not the time necessarily that we want to have the 25-step Kokedama complex craft project with our plant crafts, right? We want low pressure activities because these folks it's so much struggle for them to manage what's going on for them, that to feel successful with something like you take a cup of this dirt and you take a cup of this dirt and you take a cup of this sand and you mix them together and you get success out of that. You're being successful. That can be really grounding for someone and very helpful in helping them reconnect with reality. What does it feel like to have that on my hands? What does that feel like? We might use things that are sensorily activating, like smells and textures and colors, because that person, it helps them to kind of orient. Where am I? What am I doing? What's happening right now? Now, the flip side of that, we don't want to use too strong of things because that person may have a lot of sensory input happening anyway if they're hearing voices and having visual hallucinations. So we don't necessarily want to add to that. They can get overwhelmed. There's a balance to be had there. And then if you have encouraging people around you, when you're experiencing psychosis, you might be able to experience some positive sensations. So we're counterbalancing what's known as anhedonia, meaning you're not experiencing joy in the things that used to bring you joy, but you might be able to find joy in a rose that smells good or a flower that smells good or something like that. And I know it looks like a typo that we have negative, positive symptoms, but in the mental health world, when we talk about positive and negative symptoms, we're not talking about good and bad. We're talking about positive symptoms being something that's added to your experience, like an auditory hallucination or a delusion, something that you would not normally have that's been positively added to you. Negative symptoms meaning something that you are lacking that you normally would have, like you lack the ability to feel pleasure in what you're doing, or you're lacking the ability to find speech, find words for your speech. So the sensory sensations can address those negative, positive symptoms, such as auditory hallucinations, by helping that person be grounded in reality. I want to say also, there are many other types of mental health disorders. Eating disorders, for instance, could be one of those. Eating disorders have to be treated in a very specific treatment ways by people that have extensive training, because the risk of fatality is very high with that population. So horticulture has been used and can be used in programs like that very effectively, but it needs to be used in conjunction with other treatments and under medical supervision in most cases, so that it can teach that person nurturing, but also so that they can be in a safe environment, because the risk is pretty high of some of those kinds of impacts. Let's talk about some special populations. What about kids and adolescents? Now, remember, adolescence does not end when you turn 18. So if you're male, adolescence goes through the end of your 20s typically. If you're female, it's somewhere in the mid-20s. And when we work with adolescents and children, we need more engaged activities. Their bodies are designed to move and run and do things most of the time. So they need to be actively engaged. Even if you're dealing with folks that, or you're working with folks that are, that have some physical limitations, they need active engagement with their minds and their hands and whatever it is that they are able to do. We need to think about safety considerations because immature frontal lobe, that means that I'm going to put it in my mouth, I'm going to turn it upside down, I'm going to dunk it in water, I am going to run with it when I shouldn't be. And it's very important that we think about those kind of considerations because we should just assume that kids are impulsive. Their frontal lobe, the part that says, maybe that's not a good idea, that hasn't developed yet. So we want to be careful of that. Young people with mental health challenges, it should be noted, their symptoms look different. This is important. If you say to me, what does an adult with depression look like? The stereotypical thing, not always the case, but the stereotypical thing would be they have low energy, they have impairment in their, they're not finding joy in things in life, they're struggling. A young person experiencing depression, probably irritable, probably defiant, probably running around angry, probably doesn't want to talk to you about it. So that young person, same symptom, completely different presentation. So it's very important to recognize that what's going on with that young person might be a mental health challenge, and we're not always going to recognize it because it doesn't look like what adult mental health challenges look like. Self-harm is very common among young people, particularly cutting, burning, that kind of thing. So it's important to have those considerations if you're using something like shears or pruning shears. Be very careful about that, non-toxic. And also, this goes without saying, but always informed consent, written informed consent with the parent or guardian is very important with children and adolescents. Written informed consent in general, very important for everybody, but with minors, we definitely want to. And that varies by jurisdiction, by state, and that kind of thing. So it's important to know the pertinent laws that you function under. Inpatient settings with mental health. So people tend to be in inpatient settings with mental health, either in a mental health crisis like psychosis or suicidality, or because they're in long-term stabilization from a chronic sort of thing. So people are often not fully aware of their surroundings. It's important to let people know what you're doing, to announce your presence and to, don't sneak up on people, that kind of thing. Don't startle people, let them know, give them a sense of heads up what's happening next. It's really important to coordinate with inpatient staff so that you don't interfere with clinic protocols. If you're in an activity room and someone says code green in the activity room, you need to know what you need to do to get out of the way for whatever is about to happen. So it's really important that you're aware of those types of restrictions and the rules that are there, and to coordinate about how people are doing. Did you come in and Morgan is having a really rough day that day? What's going on? So that you can help with that. Or maybe today is not a good day for her to participate in the mental health activity or the horticulture activity. Also very important to inventory every single thing you bring in and every single thing you take out. That includes paper, because people can wad paper up and try to choke on it. So paper, dirt, rubber bands, paper clips, anything that you bring in needs to be inventoried before you take it out. And then obviously we want to avoid the dangerous stuff. Strings, not okay. Choking hazards, poisonous, that. And this is probably the most important thing that we can do in an inpatient setting. Treat the residents with respect and equality. You're probably talking to them on one of the worst days of their life. So if you are encountering someone, the best thing you can do is treat them as a human being and give them the dignity and the respect that you would want if you were in a similar set of circumstances. I'm trying to fly fast. Sorry, I'm kind of running over my time. It's hard to cover all of mental health in a brief period of time.
You're doing great, Morgan. Keep going.
So let's talk about neurodiversity. Everybody has neurodiversity. Neurodiversity just means our brains are wired differently, and we are all wired differently. But typically when people are talking about neurodiversity, they're usually using it in terms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, ASD, giftedness, intellectual disabilities and intellectual diversity, and other things like that. So people that are experiencing neurodiversity, which is all of us, but anyone who's experiencing neurodiversity that makes them, puts them into a category that we sometimes would call neurodivergent, meaning that something about their brain wiring just helps them see the world through a different lens. There are implications for that, for how we work in those situations. So neurodiversity, not necessarily a mental health disorder per se, but it is important that we recognize people see the world through a different lens when they are in that kind of, when their brains are wired differently. Some individuals might need more structure and support. They might need to know what's going on. There might need to be a picture category of steps that are happening. They might need to have a card that has all of the steps of what we are doing so that they can follow along, not just verbally, but also pictorially. They might need to have something that seems relatively easy broken down into smaller steps so that they can follow the smaller steps. They might need to have samples so they can see what the finished product is that they're working toward. So in other words, we don't want to just rely on verbal prompting. We want to be able to have a lot of different ways that people can access the instructions so that they are able to be successful. And then we want to be careful about how we're setting up social situations. People come from a variety of different backgrounds and neurodiversity related to social situations. So not everyone wants to share the scissors. So, and we shouldn't necessarily, unless that's a treatment goal that we're working on, expect that that's going to be a successful environment for them. Maybe we just need more scissors, or maybe we need to do an activity that doesn't have to involve that, and people can co-work beside each other. Target the learning objectives. So if social situation is one of the things that we're trying to work on, then we want to set people up for success. Don't just have one pair of scissors and then we assume that they can figure out how to share. We might have to have people have step-by-step instructions on how to share the scissors. So those kinds of things, and then don't imply meanings. If you have something that you need done in a particular way, make sure you say it, make sure you're clear in your instructions, and that helps everyone to feel successful and not feel frustrated. All right, gardening and therapy. So therapy in this sense, meaning mental health therapy, right? So licensed mental health therapists and others sometimes incorporate gardening into nature because even though we're not trained horticulture therapists, guess what? We figured this out on our own. We went out and we gardened and it made us feel better. So we're like, cool, let's do this with the clients. So when we engage in that, we do it in a variety of settings. There are therapists that just go out into nature, that do kind of ecotherapy, and horticultural therapy itself and therapeutic horticulture is used by a variety of different people. Horticultural therapists, recreational therapists, occupational therapists. It's used in a variety of settings. Yay, horticultural therapy, it's broad and useful. When we talk about mental health therapy, particularly, nature becomes a third part of the therapy dyad. Therapist, client, nature. So if it's raining that day and we wanted to go on a long walk, but we couldn't, that's an opportunity to process the sense of disappointment. That becomes a way for us to interact with our environment. There are wilderness settings where you can go out into nature, forest bathing, where you go out and have like basically mindful walks through the forest environment, other forms of outdoor time. There are lots of talk therapies that are now being taken outside for us to explore doing that in the world. And there are associations of nature-based therapists that are sharing ideas and pioneering research. Also, one of the things that is a growing field in the therapy world is eco-anxiety, people who are experiencing anxiety as a result of climate change. And so there are therapists that are specializing in using the natural environment and horticultural methods and other things to treat that in and of itself. So it's a very exciting time to be a therapist who's interested in horticulture and nature. I am one of them. I encourage other therapists to do the same and to be there. Oh, I went past my slide. There we go. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry I took extra time. It's very hard to like condense down in there and I could talk all day about this. So I apologize if I went over on my time, but that is the end of what I was going to share.
Awesome. Thanks, Morgan. And we're not really holding you to any specific time. Your review and explanations were easily understandable for a very, very complex topic, and how you integrated horticulture into mental health strategies will help all of us in our practices and in our personal lives. And one of the phrases that you used, gardening provides tangible grounding, I think really speaks to that. So thank you very much. Good.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask if participants have questions for either Morgan or our next speaker, Hillary, please put them in the chat box. And we had asked at the top of the webinar for people to list or identify programs using people-plant activities with mental health populations, put those in the chat box, and we're getting a good response for that. So we'll touch on those at the conclusion and the question and answer. So awesome. So I'm going to ask Hillary Lindsay, our next speaker, to start sharing her screen. And while she's doing that, I'll do her introduction. So Hillary coordinates Common Roots Urban Farm, Woodside, which is located on the grounds of the Nova Scotia Hospital, a mental health and addictions hospital. Hillary works with both in and out patients at the hospital, as well as members of the larger community who are struggling with mental health. Hillary's experience in agriculture and horticulture and her interest in mental health puts her in the right place at the right time. And this was when the large health organization decided to initiate urban farms as part of their health services, which is an interesting model. Two such urban farms were established in the Halifax, Dartmouth, Nova Scotia area, and Hillary assumed leadership of the Common Roots Urban Farm Woodside. So Hillary, talk to us about your approach working with patients and the general public and how gardening can support mental health. I see your screen is up. It looks fabulous. So why don't you show us video? I'm going to mute myself. And
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Thanks, Morgan, for that great overview. It was really helpful for me as well. Yeah, I just want to, let's see if I can move on to the next screen. There we go. I just want to give a little bit of context about where I work. As Leslie mentioned, it's the Nova Scotia Hospital, which is a mental health and addictions hospital. I don't actually work for the hospital. I don't work for the Nova Scotia Health Authority either. I work for MetroWorks, which is a nonprofit. And so we essentially have a, partnership with the hospital where we use the land, and I also kind of do everything I can to make sure that the garden is accessible and useful to patients and staff at the hospital. So I'll be talking a bit about that. Yeah, and actually one of the reasons the Nova Scotia Hospital was so keen to have the garden originally was that, mental health and addictions hospitals often come with a lot of stigma. There's a lot of stigma associated with being in the hospital and even with the grounds of the hospital itself. And so to have this kind of vibrant, kind of living, alive, exciting space happening on the hospital grounds was hoped that that would help with the stigma, and I think it has. Yeah, and in many ways, the garden is kind of a bridge space for patients and the general public between the hospital and the community. It's kind of on hospital grounds, but it's like open to the general public. So works well that way. So basically, I'm just going to take you on a little garden tour and kind of explain each of the different areas of the garden and how those work for people who are engaging with the garden. Excuse me. So just to start, the first area are the common plots, and the common plots are round plots, and they're along the edge of the pathway, kind of the main pathway that goes through the garden that you can see there. And basically they're common, as the name suggests, and so they're open for anyone to taste and smell and take from. We try to kind of plant things that are like fun to explore and smell. Often, like herbs, for example, are a really good example. Lemon balm and mint, where when I'm talking to patients or working with patients, for example, or just anyone, being able to go over and smell them and taste them is just really great for the senses, and just like a fun thing to do and to discover. We'll also plant perennials and things like, hascaps, which are something maybe that people haven't seen before. We try to have good labels in the common plots so that people kind of know what they're looking at, and we'll specifically put signs in plots when there's something that's ready to be tasted or explored. So these plots are often used just, patients who are familiar with the plots will kind of come and check on them, or rec therapists or occupational therapists who are walking through the garden will kind of point things out to patients who might be new to the hospital. And like I said, also just open to the general public, open to anyone who's walking through, if patients are walking through with their families, or like I said, just the general public. They're kind of a more educational and interesting space, and they're also just on a purely kind of the functional side of things in terms of an urban farm, to have those there and an invitation to taste and try things there. The idea is that hopefully people won't kind of venture into people's, private gardens. So that they also have that role as well. So second area that I'm going to talk about is the market garden, and that's where I spend a lot of my time. I work there with volunteers, and there's usually a couple of seasonal staff that work there with me as well. And when patients are out on the grounds of the hospital, they're welcome to help out in whatever we're doing if they're interested. Generally, people who are out on passes on the grounds means that they're kind of, they're healthy enough to participate in something like that. But it's a very soft and open, invitation. It's kind of rare actually that people will be interested, but every once in a while there is a patient who's actually super keen and will kind of, whenever they have a pass, they'll come out and kind of want to help out here and there. And this year we've actually started a more formalized program. It's a pre-employment program there's kind of one of the units at the hospital is more of a kind of transitional community space where people will stay there just if they're not quite ready to enter into the community. And so partnered with that unit, and we're doing a pre-employment program where people are kind of learning some of the kind of basics of showing up on time and, learning to take direction and, talk to people and things like that. The idea isn't to train people to be gardeners, although there was a patient recently who was really interested in landscaping and ended up actually getting a job with a landscaping company, which was great. Yeah, and all volunteers and staff need, in terms of the safety, need to have a criminal record check, and are also go through an orientation where, I make sure people are aware that the urban farm is on the grounds of a mental health and addictions hospital, and that they may be interacting with patients when they're volunteering or working. It's not a detailed, mental health orientation. I kind of tell people that they're not necessarily going to know, patients won't be identified, and they won't necessarily be able to tell who is a patient, and that's totally fine. And that just to generally, a couple things to keep in mind is, no photos, and just really also people also sign a statement around privacy. And yeah, we just kind of try to keep the conversation just open-ended, no kind of probing questions or anything like that. And just try to create a really warm and welcoming environment where we're working on things side by side. What else? Anything else I wanted to? No, I think that's it. Yeah, in terms of the produce that we grow in the market garden, we do have a market stand where we sell the produce, usually starting sometime in June. Yeah, so we do have that, and we also donate to community programs as well. And we try our best to make sure that as much of the vegetables we grow kind of get into the stomachs of patients at the hospital. That's become more difficult during COVID because we're not, well, first of all, cooking isn't happening on the units as much as it was. To be clear, the produce that we grow do not actually go into the meals, unfortunately, that the people eat at the hospital. That's for a variety of reasons, one being that we're not growing enough for that. But also, actually, there's no longer a kitchen at the Nova Scotia Hospital. The meals are made in Halifax, and they're just warmed up at the Nova Scotia Hospital. So the produce that we do kind of bring onto the units when we can are more like supplementary, like snacking things. And also, again, if there's some cooking programming happening on the unit, and also that's something that I used to participate in pre-COVID, we'll donate produce to that. Sometimes we send patients home with vegetables if they've kind of shown a particular interest, and I kind of know when they're leaving. And one way in particular that is a more kind of consistent way that we've been able to connect patients with fresh produce is that the dietitians at the Nova Scotia Hospital are real champions of the garden. And when they were before COVID, when they were seeing patients who were just coming in for they were just outpatients, like coming in for an appointment, they would have a bunch of vegetables in the fridge that they could send people home with if people were interested. They've been doing all their appointments on the phone or virtually since COVID. So one thing that we've been able to do, and we're actually doing pre-COVID as well, was to have vouchers for our market stand. So people could come and get a few vegetables to take home. So yeah, probably as most of you know, a lot of people living with mental health challenges also struggle with not having access to fresh, healthy food, not being able to afford it. And in no way do I kind of suggest that we're kind of addressing that problem, but it is just a small thing, and a small thing that I think is really appreciated. People really, I think, feel the kind of care that goes into the vegetables that are grown, and it just often feels special to be able to send people home with something good to eat. So the third area of Common Roots is the community garden. And so those plots are 4 by 12. We have about 85 of those plots. And those plots are open to the general public, or so to individuals or groups. It's $30 for the growing season. And we also have a number of subsidized plots available as well if money is a barrier. And yeah, we don't, basically, if people say that they would like a subsidized plot, they get one. Yeah, about 16 of those plots are gardened by patients at the hospital. And so that's either, like, for example, there's one patient this year who's caring for a plot on his own. Most of those plots, though, are gardened by groups, specifically units at the hospital who have 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 plots that they care for with my support. So how does the programming work in the community garden? So essentially, I reach out to, in particular, rec therapists and occupational therapists at the hospital. And if they're new, make sure that they know about the garden and about the opportunities there. And we'll just talk about the possible ways that we could kind of connect patients with the garden. So often that's the weekly garden programming, which I'll talk about. Sometimes, though, there's one unit where quite a few of the people on the unit are elderly, and so they kind of have their own garden because it's difficult for them to get down to our garden. And so we're kind of helping them care for that garden there. And then, like I said, sometimes it's bringing vegetables onto the unit. Sometimes it's a pre-employment program. So it can look like a few different things. But in terms of the weekly garden programming, usually rec therapists, sometimes occupational therapists, as well as rec rec therapist assistants, depending on people's availability, will come out with a group of patients. And it's pretty simple. Essentially, we garden together. So we go through all the steps of the garden season. So depending on what is happening in the garden at that time, we do. So at this time, we're kind of planting seeds, we're preparing the soil. So an important thing to mention is, as I said before, I'm not employed by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I'm not a therapist, not a social worker. So I do not know the kind of diagnoses of the people who are coming out. I do not know the history. I often don't, or I usually don't know how many people are coming out. I don't really know anything. I'll know the unit that they're coming from, and but that's about it. And but they are, as I said, coming out with someone who's supporting them. So it's kind of not, that part of it isn't my responsibility in terms of their particular diagnosis. But what I do is just try to kind of receive people where they are and pick up pretty quick if people have a lot of energy or knowledge, or are kind of moving pretty slowly. And like I said, we'll just kind of go through the steps and work at people's paces, and plant seeds and eventually harvest. And that's when things get kind of more exciting and fun. Well, I shouldn't say more exciting. It's pretty exciting at this time of year too, planting the seeds, etc. So yeah, just a little bit. I mean, Morgan touched on this, but kind of the joys of gardening and the joys of harvest. And I really definitely see in the day-to-day how much gardening really does kind of light people up. People often start talking about, their grandmother's garden or their mother's garden. And most patients that I work with haven't necessarily gardened before, although some have, for sure. Some have gardens of their own that they talk about. This slide is just on the joys of harvest. And I think it's kind of a really magical thing, picking food off a plant, planting a seed and tending it, and then actually being able to eat what you grow is like a really miraculous thing that is pretty exciting. And especially for people who, haven't seen that before and experienced that before. And that's a lot of people. So I for sure get to witness that all the time. And and the garden is just full of so much life and so many lessons. That there's like that far slide, there is a sunflower that was actually growing out of the bottom of one of our raised plots. So just kind of amazing resilience. And there's a lot of life in the garden. And I've heard over and over from rec therapists and occupational therapists how even if the patients they're working with aren't directly involved in the garden, to be able to look out at the garden from their windows or to walk by the garden, there's a lot happening there, and it changes every day. And hospitals can be pretty austere places in a lot of ways, not necessarily always super healing places. And I like to think that the garden is a kind of a healing space and a space where people can really kind of connect with some of the beauty that is happening outside, and discoveries. And in terms of the garden programming, and there's just really endless possibilities. That's a photo of a community oven that's actually not on our site, but at another local park. And so when that was something, again, that was happening pre-COVID, where groups would kind of go and make pizza, but in that case, we'd sent them with, peppers and fresh basil and tomatoes, etc., for their pizza. And so it's pretty fun to be able to make those connections. I also included a photo of the lavender because there's also kind of opportunities for making sachets, for example, with, dried lavender or dried roses. Did kind of flower arranging before with units. And so, yeah, there's a lot of possibilities. Making tea, when I used to go into the unit more, I would bring, lemon balm or mint, make tea. And that's an experience that a lot of people have never had before, like of being able to pick something and then make something delicious from it. And again, especially in a hospital, that's, not something that happens very often. Yeah, and the fourth area that I just wanted to talk about are the production plots. And so Common Roots-Woodside, this is our 8th season, and the production plots have really only happened in the past few years. And the main drivers of the production plots were that we have a lot of newcomer gardeners who are involved in the farms, and they are hungry for space. And they're people who often gardened extensively or farmed in their home countries, and want space to grow, are now here and are living in apartment buildings and wanting space to grow. So the plots are specifically for people who have farming and gardening experience. So they're bigger, they're 3x20. And so they're people who, and by the way, most people just find that like an incredibly small space, and they actually want way more space than that. And some people have been able to get multiple plots over the years. And I mean, certainly if we can keep growing, we will. And yeah, so people who have gardening experience, but are also food insecure in some ways. And so I think mostly, or maybe all of the newcomers who are involved in the garden are refugees. And so, yeah, many are food insecure, can't afford fresh and healthy vegetables, and also can't buy and access the food that they're used to having in abundance. For example, many of the people who are gardening with us are from the Congo or areas in Africa where there's a specific green langa-langa that is like a key part of their diet. Or mustard greens is something that a lot of people from Nepal, Bhutan eat a ton of. And we also have a lot of people from that region as well. So they are able to kind of grow the food that is culturally important to them and connects them to their roots. So yeah, as I said, the plots are kind of for people with gardening experience and are food insecure, but there's a huge mental health spin-off for the garden that we've kind of heard again and again from people who are participating. Yeah, as I mentioned, people are refugees, and in general, that means in terms of like Morgan's slideshow, people have experienced trauma. They've had to flee from their homes. Many have experienced war, and yeah, they're suddenly in a space where I actually was interviewing one of the women for a film project last week, and she was talking about how she'd grown her own food and is originally from the Congo, I believe. And when she came to Canada, she was safe physically, but traumatized and actually unable to eat, like didn't know how to eat because she didn't know, like going to a grocery store was a foreign thing, and normally you would just grow everything that you ate. So yeah, really difficult and traumatizing experiences. So all that to say, the garden isn't enough, but it does help some. Even though people have less space than they want, they do have space to plant the seeds that they've kind of brought with them. They're able to grow food for themselves and their family. Just to have access to a green space and a beautiful space. You can see from these slides that the urban farm is on a kind of beautiful piece of land. That's super important for people, a place where they can connect to other members of their community, both newcomer community and then just the kind of broader community as well. Yeah, and people often talk about a place to go, something, again, like Morgan talked about, something to take over or to take care of, rather. These two women here are actually, we're doing a bit of an experiment this year where they have their own micro market garden where they're growing food, primarily a lot of African eggplant and langa-langa for their community. And yeah, it's really exciting, and I'm excited to see what they grow. They're very skilled gardeners, very extremely hard workers, and yeah, they're doing a beautiful job. So yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the Florida Horticultural Network and the Nova Scotia Horticultural Network. It was a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. That was really interesting, Hillary, I'm sorry.
No problem.
The partnership for Common Roots-Woodside is really interesting and hopefully a model that can be replicated. And I think these forums allow people to get some new ideas. It is inspiring to see the side-by-side gardening activities with patients and community members, and how you have really been able to create a warm environment, destigmatizing mental health. I think that's something that we all work towards. One of the things that you mentioned that I wanted to touch on was the process that does not provide you with health information on participants. And I wanted to share that this is pretty common related to privacy issues and health information. And you and I, in previous conversations, you had said to me that this allows you to see each person as a person and not a diagnosis. And I think this was one of the points that Morgan touched on: respect the person. And again, I think this is an important tenet that most of us in this field, or the multiple fields that we come from, really bring to the work that we do. So, awesome. Why don't you go ahead and stop sharing your screen? And I'm going to ask the two presenters, Morgan and Hillary, you're already on, and I think I'm up as well. You can see us, and we have our video and our audio on, so we can take questions. We go ahead and